4:30 in the afternoon on January 10, 1943, in a narrow office on the 4th floor of the Admiralty in London, a thin naval officer with a receding hairline and an overactive imagination stared at a single sentence on a classified memo and wondered if anyone in history had ever tried something this unpleasant on purpose. A suggestion, not a very nice one: place misleading papers in the inside pocket of a dead man and let them be found by the enemy. The officer was Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague, a barrister in peacetime, and the memo was the now famous Trout Memo, a brainstorming document comparing deception in war to fly fishing, probably ghost-written by a talented assistant named Ian Fleming, who would later create a certain fictional spy. For months the Allies had been arguing over a brutal problem. In 1943 they needed to invade southern Europe, and geographically there was one obvious target: Sicily, the soft underbelly of the Axis. It was so obvious that even Hitler had pointed at a map and said, surely they will go for Sicily. If the Germans heavily reinforced the island, Allied troops could be massacred on the beaches. If the Allies chose a less obvious target like Greece, they faced long supply lines and difficult terrain. They wanted to hit Sicily, but only if they could convince the Germans they were actually going somewhere else. That was the challenge given to the London Controlling Section, Britain's small secret staff for strategic deception. Colonel John Bevan, the head of the unit, walked into Montague's office, tossed the Trout Memo on his desk, and told him to stop treating it as theory and start treating it as a to-do list. Could they really turn a corpse into a weapon, a delivery system for fake documents, powerful enough to move entire divisions of German soldiers away from the real invasion beaches? To answer that, Montague teamed up with a lanky RAF officer from MI5 named Charles Cholmondeley, a man whose nose dripped constantly from allergies and whose mind produced wild ideas as easily as most people produce small talk. Together they began to reverse engineer the entire operation from the end backwards. If a German intelligence officer in Spain or Berlin opened a briefcase and read documents hinting the Allies would invade Greece and Sardinia, how could they make him absolutely convinced the papers were genuine, not a plant? Spain was the key. On paper, it was neutral. In reality, it was full of German agents and sympathetic officials. The town of Huelva on the southern coast was notorious for one thing. Whenever anything washed ashore, local authorities quietly copied any documents and passed them to the German Abwehr. If a British officer's body accidentally floated up near Huelva, the Germans would almost certainly see whatever he was carrying. That answered the where. The how was uglier. They needed a body, one that could convincingly pass for a British staff officer who had died in a plane crash at sea. It had to be intact enough to endure autopsy, yet anonymous enough that nobody would ask awkward questions like, "Where is my son S. real grave?" Montague visited pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury and the London coroner Bentley Purchase to ask a deeply macabre question. Could a corpse that had been dead for days convincingly look like a fresh drowning victim pulled from the sea? Spilsbury told him yes, under the right conditions. Death by shock or poison could easily be misread as death by immersion, especially by a Spanish doctor in wartime conditions with limited time and no incentive to dig deeper. Purchase agreed to look for a suitable body, on one condition: there must be no relatives who cared where it was buried. Weeks passed. Winter bombs fell on London. The Italian front dragged on. Then, on January 28, 1943, Purchase sent a quiet message. "I think I have the body you need." It was the body of a Welsh drifter named Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who had died after eating bread laced with rat poison in an abandoned warehouse near King's Cross. The poison had caused internal organ failure, not obvious external wounds, and in the chaos of wartime London there were no family members to claim the body. Montague looked at the thin, pale corpse on a mortuary slab and realised that this anonymous man, who in life could not afford a proper room, might in death help decide the fate of armies. It was cold, it was clinical, and it was undeniably ghoulish. But the war left little room for sentiment. Purchase warned them the body could only be kept refrigerated for a few months before decomposition made it useless. If they were going to turn Glyndwr Michael into the most important major in the British Royal Marines, they had to begin immediately. And right here, before we go any further into this dark little corner of World War II, I need to ask you for one quick favour. If stories like this, where forgotten lives intersect with massive decisions, are the kind you want more of in your feed, take half a second to tap that like button. It tells the algorithm that history isn't boring, and it really does help us keep digging up these almost unbelievable operations. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the second and third acts of this wild deception. Back to the story, and to the question that now obsessed Montague and Cholmondeley: how do you turn a dead Welsh labourer into a living, breathing British officer, complete with memories, debts, loves and secrets convincing enough that even hardened Nazi intelligence officers would believe every word in his pockets? The answer began with a name: Captain, Acting Major, William Martin, Royal Marines. In the cold language of paperwork, William Martin already existed. He had been quietly added to naval lists as a real officer to make sure no bureaucrat ever flagged him as fictional. But a name and a rank were not enough to fool the Abwehr. The Germans had a thorough file system. They could check whether this Major Martin had a career history, whether anyone had mentioned him, whether his story felt lived in rather than assembled. So Montague and Cholmondeley set out to build a life for a man who had never drawn breath. They gave him a job, staff officer at Combined Operations Headquarters, working under Lord Louis Mountbatten, exactly the kind of role that might require him to carry sensitive planning documents across the Mediterranean. They gave him a home, a slight overdrawn bank account, a London address, a stern father who wrote scolding letters. They added minor but very human flaws: a letter from a worried landlord about overdue rent, a stern note from his club about an unpaid bill, theatre ticket stubs, a used bus ticket. They invented a fiancée, Pam, and filled his pockets with proof of their messy human relationship photographs of a smiling woman in a swimsuit, love letters that were affectionate but hinted at small arguments over how often he wrote. Every piece of pocket litter had a purpose: cigarettes of the right brand, a silver cross, a key, a cheap pen, all items that would wear the right scuffs and stains when handled for weeks. To get an ID photo that didn't look like a corpse, they found a living man, Captain Ronnie Reed of MI5, whose face roughly matched the dead man S build. He put on a Royal Marine uniform, stood stiffly before the camera, and became the face of Major Martin. The uniform itself was worn around the office by Cholmondeley and rubbed with dirt and cigarette ash to give it the lived-in look of a man who had travelled, spilled coffee, sat through long briefings. Someone joked that more effort was being put into creasing Major Martin's trousers than some real officers receive for their entire careers. The heart of the deception, however, was the briefcase. It had to contain documents so valuable that the Germans would want them copied immediately, yet so mundane in tone that no one would suspect they'd been written for enemy eyes. After dozens of drafts, the team settled on a series of letters between high-ranking Allied officers. The most important was a personal letter from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander in North Africa, casually discussing Allied plans. The wording was artful. It implied that upcoming operations would target Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily as a diversion. In other words, it said the exact opposite of the truth. There was also a letter from Mountbatten to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, referencing a future meeting in North Africa that lined up with Major Martin's supposed journey, and a draft forward request for a combined operations manual. Mountbatten wanted Eisenhower to endorse just dull enough to feel real. Everything was designed to feel slightly untidy, mildly bureaucratic, exactly like the thousands of real memoranda sliding across desks each day. The problem was, how do you keep a briefcase attached to a corpse in the open sea? They worried about rigor mortis in the fingers, about waves tearing the case away. In the end, they used a trick from bank couriers: a leather-covered chain passing from the handle, up a trench coat sleeve and looped around the belt under the coat. If someone found the body, they'd see that the case was still in his possession, not drifting freely. When they were finally ready, they dressed Glinda Michael one last time, transforming him into Major William Martin. On the night of April 17th, 1943, in a chilled mortuary room, Montague, Cholmondeley, and the coroner struggled with one last indignity. The corpse's feet had frozen solid, and they simply couldn't get his boots on. Someone fetched an electric heater. For 20 awkward, silent minutes they warmed a dead man's feet for a secret mission. When the boots slid on at last, the pocket litter was placed where any doctor would look, the identity cards tucked away, the letters sealed in their envelopes, and the briefcase secured. The body was loaded into a custom-built metal canister packed with dry ice. As the ice sublimated into carbon dioxide, it would displace oxygen and keep the corpse from rotting during its journey. The canister was labelled innocuously as Special Apparatus Handle with Care Optical Instruments. Shortly after midnight, a racing driver turned MI5 chauffeur, Jock Horsfall, drove the canister out of London in a nondescript van, tearing up dark country roads at speeds that made Montague and Cholmondeley cling to the metal walls. They arrived at the Scottish port of Greenock bruised but intact. There, the canister was quietly loaded aboard the British submarine HMS Seraph. Her commander, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, had been told only that he was carrying equipment for a sensitive meteorological experiment to be dropped off the Spanish coast. His crew were instructed not to ask questions. The Seraph slipped beneath the waves and headed south through U-boat-infested waters toward the Bay of Cadiz. Twice she was depth-charged by enemy aircraft. Twice she survived, shaken but unbroken, the strange metal coffin in her torpedo compartment rattling with each shockwave. On the night of April 29th, Joule brought Seraph to periscope depth just off Huelva and spent hours reconnoitring the coastline. He needed to be close enough that the tides would wash the body ashore, but far enough to avoid Spanish patrols. At 4:15 a.m. on April 30th, under a dark sky and calm sea, Seraph surfaced. Joule ordered all but a handful of officers below decks. They manhandled the cold canister out onto the casing and unscrewed the bolts. When the lid came free, the smell of cold chemical and stale air drifted out. The officers stared down at the slack face of Major William Martin, his hair slicked back, his uniform neat, his briefcase chained to his belt. In the dim red light, with waves slapping gently against the hull, it must have looked less like a military operation and more like some pagan sea burial. Joule read a few lines from Psalm 39, "I will take heed to my ways, that I sin not with my tongue," then they slid the body overboard. It hit the water with hardly a splash and began to drift toward shore, the briefcase tugging at his side. The officers resealed the now empty canister, submerged a dozen miles out, and blew it up with plastic explosives so nobody would ever find the delivery system. Then Joule tapped out a brief encrypted signal to London, Mincemeat completed. Somewhere in the darkness, the corpse of a Welsh tramp, now wearing the life of an invented officer, floated slowly towards Spain, toward fishermen, doctors, policemen, German spies, and eventually Adolf Hitler himself. At around 9:30 on the morning of April 30th, 1943, a Spanish fisherman from Huelva noticed something in the water that did not belong there. A body in a British life jacket, bobbing gently among the waves, wearing a trench coat and clutching a leather briefcase chained to its belt. He reported it to local authorities, who dragged the corpse ashore and did exactly what British planners had hoped. They notified both the Spanish Navy and the British Vice-Consul, Francis Hazelden, a quietly observant man who had already been briefed on what to expect. The Spanish, officially neutral but thoroughly infiltrated by German intelligence, took custody of the body in the briefcase. Hazelden immediately sent a coded report to London. The fish had taken the bait. Over the next few days, a choreographed diplomatic dance unfolded. London sent anxious-sounding telegrams demanding that Hazelden retrieve the briefcase and its important contents as soon as possible. Hazelden dutifully passed the request to Spanish officials, making sure to sound increasingly desperate. Every message was written with one extra audience in mind: German codebreakers. The British knew that the Germans had cracked some of their diplomatic ciphers. They wanted the Abwehr to be reading every word and thinking, whatever is in that briefcase, London really does not want us to see it. Meanwhile, in Huelva, the Spanish authorities carried out an autopsy. Hazelden attended. The corpse had been in cold storage for months, but warm Andalusian air and the smell of the sea covered many clues. The doctor noted water in the lungs and concluded, as Spilsbury had predicted, that Major William Martin had died from drowning following an air crash. Hazelden, pretending to be squeamish, encouraged them to cut the process short and head to lunch, reducing the risk that anyone would notice inconsistencies, like the absence of typical air crash trauma. The briefcase, however, remained locked and chained. Spanish officials assured Hazelden that it would be delivered to him unopened, but word of its existence had already reached the local German agent Adolf Klaus, an agricultural technician on paper and a seasoned intelligence officer in reality. Through cooperative Spanish contacts, Klaus arranged to have the briefcase quietly opened. Carefully, so as not to break seals, technicians slid the letters out, copied them, then replaced them, using steam to reseal envelopes with almost invisible marks. Within days, photographic copies of General Nie's apparently candid letter about Allied plans were on a plane to Berlin. The originals, looking slightly damp but otherwise intact, were finally handed over to an outwardly relieved Hazelden, who sent them back to London via diplomatic bag. In the Admiralty, cryptographers ran a simple test. They examined the paper fibres under magnification. The fibres showed clear signs that the letters had been opened and refolded while wet. Perfect. Simultaneously, at Bletchley Park, the codebreakers of GCCS were listening in on German reactions through ultra-decrypts. On May 14th, intercept operators picked up a message from the German High Command to their forces in the Mediterranean, summarising the stolen letters. The main Allied attack was expected in the Balkans, specifically Greece, with a subsidiary operation against Sardinia. Sicily, it said, would only be the target of diversionary attacks. In London, Brigadier Leslie Hollis sent a gleeful note to Churchill, who was in Washington at the time. Mincemeat swallowed rod, line and sinker by the right people, and from the best information they look like acting on it. The ripple effects were immediate. Hitler, already suspicious of Sicily's obviousness, seized on the documents as confirmation of his fears about Greece. He ordered panzer divisions and elite units moved from France and Germany to the Balkans. Existing units in Greece and the Aegean were reinforced. Sardinia received extra attention. Sicily still received some troops. No plan could strip it bare, but its defences were not upgraded with the urgency one would expect for the gateway to Europe. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself was tasked with preparing the Greek defences for an invasion that would never come. German naval units shifted their minds and patrol patterns. The Luftwaffe redistributed aircraft. Supply chains were rerouted to support phantom operations. Every one of those decisions made the real target Sicily slightly softer. Back in Britain, Montagu kept reinforcing the illusion. The name Martin, William, acting major, Royal Marines was quietly included in official casualty lists printed in the Times on June 4th, alongside genuine names of airmen lost at sea. The fiancée Pam received a fictional telegram of condolence. Files were created in dusty cabinets so that, if any German agent ever checked public records after the war, Major Martin would still be there. For the real man, Glyndwr Michael, there was a modest Catholic burial in Welver under his false name. Only a handful of people in London knew whose body lay under the stone marked William Martin. Born 1907, died 1943, beloved son of John Glynn Martin. Decades later, historians would add a small line acknowledging his true identity, but in 1943 the war moved on too quickly for anyone to pause long over a single grave. In early July, the Allied armada for Operation Husky, the actual invasion of Sicily, assembled in North Africa. When the landings began on the night of July 9th to 10th, they faced resistance, brutal firefights, and chaotic weather, but they did not face the full weight of German reserves that might have been present if the enemy had expected a major assault there. Several German divisions sat in Greece and the Balkans, waiting for an invasion that never arrived, while Sicilian defenders were mostly Italian troops with lower morale and mixed equipment. Historians still argue about exactly how many lives Operation Mincemeat saved, but contemporary German documents and post-war analyses agree on one central point. The corpse and its briefcase persuaded Hitler to keep his strongest cards far from the real battlefield. The invasion of Sicily succeeded after 5 weeks of hard fighting. It knocked Italy out of the war, opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and set the stage for the eventual invasion of mainland Italy. In the shadows of that campaign, in rooms full of filing cabinets and maps, a quiet satisfaction spread through the deception staff. Their bizarre plan had worked. A dead man had been used as a weapon not in some gruesome biological sense, but as a carrier of lies so convincing that dictators moved armies. And as the guns thundered in Sicily, Ewan Montagu sat down at his Admiralty desk and began to sketch the outline of a story he could never fully tell, not yet, about the man who never was. In the years immediately after the war, Operation Mincemeat remained buried under layers of secrecy, but its impact lingered in the way Allied planners thought about deception. The small London controlling section that had turned Glyndwr Michael into Major William Martin became a model for later psychological and information operations. Montagu himself received an OBE in 1944. Cholmondeley, who had quietly done much of the legwork and dream work, received a lesser but still significant honour. Within intelligence circles, the operation became a kind of legend, proof that you could fool sophisticated enemy analysts not with elaborate forgeries or Hollywood theatrics, but with small, boring details, ticket stubs, love letters, bank overdrafts stitched into a coherent human story. Deception manuals began to stress what Mincemeat had proven. The key to a successful lie is not how dramatic it is, but how mundane it sounds. At the same time, there was an uncomfortable ethical question that only occasionally surfaced in memos and private conversations. Was it right to use a homeless man's body this way? Officially, Montagu always referred to the corpse in vague terms, calling him a bit of a ne'er-do-well who had done the only worthwhile thing in his life after his death, a formulation that made some later readers wince. The truth, uncovered decades later by historian Roger Morgan, was that Glyndwr Michael had been a labourer from Wales, scarred by family tragedy and economic hardship, who drifted into London and died alone in a derelict building at 34. He had not volunteered for anything. His consent was impossible. Yet his anonymous death gave British planners the raw material for a deception that may have shortened the war and saved thousands of soldiers on both sides from dying in Sicily or Greece. In 1950, the curtain lifted slightly when Duff Cooper, a former cabinet minister who had been in on the secret, published a thinly disguised novel called Operation Heartbreak about a corpse in a British uniform washed up on the Spanish coast. Security officials realised that the skeleton of the story was out in the open and decided the best defence was a controlled disclosure. Montagu was authorised to write a sanitised version. Working over a single weekend, he produced The Man Who Never Was, published in 1953, which told the tale of Major William Martin in lively, polished prose, leaving out things like ultra-decrypts and the true identity of the body. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a film in 1956, with Clifton Webb playing a fictionalised Montagu and the Corpse S story dramatised for audiences who had no idea they were watching one of the strangest true operations of the war. The real Glyndwr Michael remained unnamed in public records until the 1990s, when researchers finally connected the dots. By then, most of the main players were gone. Ian Fleming, who had helped shape the original Trout memo, had long since turned his wartime experience into James Bond novels where dead bodies with secret documents were just another Tuesday. Ewan Montagu had returned to the law and community work. Charles Cholmondeley retired to the countryside, his role in one of history's greatest hoaxes largely unknown outside specialist histories. And on a hillside in Huelva, the grave that once bore only the legend William Martin received a new inscription acknowledging the man beneath. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. When we step back and look at Operation Mincemeat from today, it is hard not to see echoes in modern information warfare. No one is dropping corpses with briefcases into the sea anymore, but the core idea planting carefully crafted information where you know your enemy will find it, wrapped in a story that feels too ordinary to be fabricated, is everywhere, from leaked documents to fake social media personas. In a way, Glyndwr Michael was the first tragic deepfake, a real human identity overwritten with a fictional one for strategic gain. Yet it's also worth remembering the context. In 1943, Allied leaders were staring at maps covered in casualty projections for landings where machine guns and artillery would reap men by the thousands. Against that backdrop, the cold calculation that one anonymous body might save untold living bodies made grim sense to people whose entire lives were spent weighing horrors against each other. Operation Mincemeat didn't win the war by itself. Soldiers still had to climb into landing craft, pilots still had to fly into flak, sailors still had to face torpedoes. But the operation tilted the odds. It nudged divisions and ships and bombers away from Sicily, away from the beaches where names like Gela and Licata and Pacino were written in blood, and toward quiet Greek harbours that never saw the invasion they were preparing to repel. Deception, in that sense, was an act of preservation as much as trickery. Today, if you visit the National Archives or the Imperial War Museum, you can see reproductions of Major Martin's papers. In Spain, you can stand by his grave and read both names, and in the story of this one bleak, brilliant operation, you can see something larger about World War II, that it was not just a clash of tanks and bombers, but a battle of stories, of what each side believed the other would do next. If this journey from a derelict building in London to the shores of Spain to Hitler's desk and the beaches of Sicily made you look at the war a little differently, do me a favour, hit that like button right now. It pushes this video out to more people who think history is just dates in a textbook and shows them that sometimes it's about a single, heartbreaking, almost unbelievable choice. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're unpacking forgotten missions, lost heroes and bizarre operations from World War II all the time. Finally, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from, and did anyone in your family serve in the Mediterranean or intelligence services during the war? Drop your stories below. Together, we're making sure that the man who never was and the man he really was and slip back into obscurity.